Funding for this edition of One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been provided by RWJ Barnabas Health, Delta Dental of New Jersey. Everyone deserves a healthy smile. Rowan University, TD Bank, PSC&G, committed to providing safe, reliable energy now and in the future. The Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey, and by New Jersey Sharing Network. Promotional support provided by NJ.com, Small News, Big News, True Jersey. And by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association.
This is One-on-One. I'm an equal American just like you are.
The jobs of tomorrow are not the jobs of yesterday.
Look at this. You got this?
Here it is, man. Look at that.
Life without dance is boring.
I don't care how good you are or how good you think you are, there is always something to learn.
Do you enjoy talking politics?
No.
People call me because they feel nobody's paying attention.
Our culture, I don't think, has ever been tested the way it's being tested right now.
That's a good question. High five.
Welcome to Gone But Not Forgotten. I'm Steve Adubato. On this edition, and we look back at a 1991 interview I did with the late Honorable Congresswoman Millicent Fenwick. She smoked a pipe. She was a former model. She was a moderate Republican. She stood up for what she believed. She stood up against the Republicans and Richard Nixon in connection with the Watergate scandal. She believed that ethics were the most important thing you could have in government and in Congress. She said to me in the interview, you know, Steve, in the end, sooner or later when we deal with problems, Democrats, Republicans, and remember, this is the thing she said, we're all in this together. And when you think back on all the people who serve in public life, could there ever be anything more important than remember that we are all in this together? Millicent Fenwick. Gone but not forgotten. Millicent Hammond Fenwick was born in 1910, the second of three children to a prominent family from Bernardsville, New Jersey. Millicent's father, Ogden Hammond, served in the New Jersey Assembly and as ambassador to Spain under President Calvin Coolidge. Her mother was Mary Stevens, whose grandfather founded Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken. In 1915, Mary Stevens was a passenger aboard the ill-fated Lusitania when it was sunk by a German submarine. Young Millicent was only 5 years old when her mother died. Later, Millicent would marry Hugh Fenwick. Their 6-year marriage ended in divorce in 1938, leaving her with 2 small children. She went to work at Vogue magazine as an assistant to the editor and a part-time model. Spurred on by social injustice, Millicent began her government service in the 1950s when she was elected to the Bernardsville Borough Council. In 1969, she was elected to her father's old seat in the Assembly, where she says she spent some of the happiest days of her career. She went on to become the state's Director of Consumer Affairs, and in 1974, at the age of 64, she was elected to the United States Congress. 8 years later, she ran for the U.S. Senate and lost in a surprising defeat to Frank Lautenberg. After that defeat, President Ronald Reagan appointed her ambassador to Rome, a position she said she loved and called her last political hurrah. Throughout her career, Millicent Fenwick's concerns have been for civil rights and social justice. Her straightforward, no-nonsense approach, along with her compassion for others, has been paid satirical tribute through the Doonesbury comic strip character of Lacey Davenport. I recently spoke with this remarkable woman, a woman whose years of public service is a true lesson in leadership.
You said that Eleanor Roosevelt had a great impact on your life. Why?
Well, it was the first time it ever occurred to me to think about somebody in public life in this way. I remember it came like a shot into my mind. My Lord, she really means it. She really means it.
Means what?
Means what she's saying. Someone said that Mr. Roosevelt, when he was governor of New York, pledged to uphold the law, would serve martinis in Hyde Park. Before dinner, Mrs. Roosevelt would leave the room. She really meant it. And you see, that became a sort of benchmark for me. That was what caused me to first notice and be respectful of and eventually fond of Bella Abzug. She really meant it.
You're comparing Bella Abzug, the congresswoman, former congresswoman from New York, from Manhattan, with Eleanor Roosevelt?
Sure. They shared the same mark that I consider one of the great important features in anybody connected with public life. Really to mean it. When you talk about justice and a rule of law that protects every citizen equally, you ought to really mean it and be prepared to put up with some inconvenience and difficulty if necessary. But Bella didn't care whether Tip O'Neill, who was terribly nice, I was very fond of him, he used to call me Fenwick Darling, and I called him Speaker Darling. We got on very well. But she didn't care whether the Speaker was supporting her bill or the subcommittee chairman was going to get her in trouble. She was doing what she thought her constituents needed. And I didn't agree with her. She and I didn't vote alike, ever, practically. But I respected her, and I got to be very fond of her because I understood what kind of a legislator she was. Do you know?
Let's go back to the question of influencing you. Other than Eleanor Roosevelt, who influenced you?
Well, Mr. Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, who said the business of government is justice. And
you quote him often.
Often, and that's been an absolute value for me. And then, you know, when I was vice chairman of the New Jersey Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, my chairman was a wonderful man, Rabbi Chertoff of Elizabeth. And I used to call him up, sometimes very disappointed with the work that I'd done during the week not being productive. And I remember one Sunday morning, when I called him, he said, "But Millicent, you've got to pay attention to something that the wisdom of the elders said 700 years ago or something. Remember, you may never arrive at the solution. You're never absolved from the responsibility of trying." And that made a tremendous impression on me, because what it was saying to me was, success is not the measure of a human being or of an idea's transcendence. Success, effort is the measure of the human being. How hard are you trying to do what?
You said once that your father and you were very, very different. You said that you were opposites in many ways, that you were amazed that he could live his whole life and not be influenced by ideology. You also said that he was a gentleman. You said it was very different than you. You were much more political, and you called yourself, you said you had a temper in a lot of ways, and that was very different.
Very bad temper, I regret to say, yes. Even as a very small baby, I had a very bad temper. And it's been hard for me to learn to control it. There's no doubt about that.
You?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Daddy was a wonderfully gentle, lovable man, extraordinary. I remember when I first went into politics, so many people in the village here would say, you know, I was a caddy on the golf course when I was young, and your father was by far the most popular man of any of the members of the club. I mean, everybody liked him. He had a sunny, warm, understanding way, hosts of friends, wherever he went.
Your mother died when you were 5 years old
Mm-hmm.
in a terrible accident.
Well, the Lusitania.
Let's talk about that.
She died at sea. Well, she was determined to go to England and France, she thought eventually. Maybe a hospital for soldiers or for people who were displaced. And the family didn't want her to, but Daddy, of course, couldn't let her go alone. She was a very headstrong person, I guess. I hardly knew her, because I was only 5 and 3 months or so when she died. But she insisted on going, and they took the Lusitania, and of course, you know what happened there.
You left school at 15.
Yes.
Why?
Well, my sister and I were at boarding school in Virginia called Foxcroft, and Daddy was nominated by Mr. Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge, to be ambassador in Spain, which he accepted. And we left in January 1926, when I was still 15. And that was the end of what might be called formal schooling. For 3 months that spring, my sister and I went to a wonderful convent, absolutely adorable convent of French nuns who had lost their health in Madagascar and had been sent to Madrid to recover. And it was adorable. There was the Mother Superior, the head of the group, and these lovely nuns. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. That was the end of our
formal education.
Formal education.
What impact did the lack of formal education have on your ultimate governing style?
I don't think any. I really don't. I cannot see. Maybe people would say, well, I mean, the reason she never got anywhere with her home health care bills and all that kind of stuff was that she didn't have the formal education that could have presented. But my own view is that my failures were not because I didn't have formal education. There was something lacking in ego, I think.
Ego?
Yes.
In you?
Yes.
How is it that someone who says she didn't have a lot of ego, possibly not a lot of confidence, how was it that you got involved in the political process?
Hitler, suddenly, this extraordinary nation, brilliant in science and music and medicine and philosophy, literate, far more literate than we were, suddenly they have Hitler. And he starts this hideous injustice. The business of government is justice. But look at his injustices. It alerted me. I was absolutely horrified.
Because of Hitler?
Because of Hitler. I hated the idea of all Jews are this and lumping people in groups. It was, to me, deeply offensive.
You got very involved in civil rights.
Yes.
Early on in your public career.
How?
How and why?
Well, you know, I was interested on account of Hitler in terrible treatment of the Jewish people and the horror of treating people in groups like that. And I joined the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And by 1951, I was on the board of the black self-help group in Newark called the Leaguers. Wonderful organization.
In Newark?
In Newark.
A wealthy Republican woman
politics.
from Bernardsville in politics, interested in the politics or the life of the city of Newark?
Look, our people, our country, our system, injustice. That's what, it was absolutely intolerable to me. How did I happen to get into Republican politics? Well, Rev Pine, who was our state senator, said, you're always talking about politics and Hitler, see? Yeah? And why don't you get busy and do something? So he encouraged me to be on the lowest form of state, organized politics, the borough. As a member of the council, I met a wonderful man, our mayor, Michael J. Nervine, great, great friend, and he taught me a lot.
How did the state legislature come up?
Michael J. Nervine wrote to our county chairman, Republican chairman, and said, you ought to run Millicent for county-wide office, freeholder or assembly. And
had you been thinking about running for higher office?
No, I didn't know he was thinking about it.
Is that where we go back to the question of ego, or?
I don't know. You see, I think it's a hand of the good Lord.
You agreed to run for the state legislature in 1969.
Right.
You get elected.
Yeah.
You're in the minority party.
Yeah.
Governor Cahill is the governor.
Yeah.
What was it that you remember about your legislative career? What stands out?
I remember a feeling, of course, a little bit, well, where are the women around here? You know what I mean. But, and there was a very big bill. This was my first moment of triumph. There was a big bill which was going to change the labor laws. Women were prohibited by law from working between midnight and 8 a.m., although it was the highest paid shift at the time. And I had consulted my friends in the NAACP and in Focus and Aspira, and I had telegrams from the heads of those local New Jersey organizations in favor of changing this to allow women to work between 12 midnight. And of course, the boys were awfully against it.
The other assemblymen.
And yes, and many of the organizations, I think most of the labor organizations were against it. And they said, how do we say that they can go risk the streets to go at 11:30 for their 12 o'clock shift? I said, are you there to take them home at midnight when they finish their 8 to 12 shift, 4 to midnight shift? And then one of them said, and how can you speak on behalf of all this women in industry when you've never been worked in a factory yourself? And I said, I have not disqualified you because you've never been a woman. And it was marvelous. I was terrified because the whole room burst into laughter and clapping and all this, and it was on the front page of the paper the next day. And I was terrified. I thought that I'm going to have an enemy for life. Not at all. He rushed up to me and he said, I just want to tell you that thanks to you, the other day, what you said, I'm on the front page of the Newark Evening News for the first time in my life.
During your career in the State Assembly, there was a floor debate on an equal rights amendment, some version of it. One of your male colleagues got up and started talking about women.
He was adorable. I'll never forget. He was at the opposite side of the chamber. But he stood up and his hands were gripped like this together, and you could see the knuckles white. He was talking from the heart. And he said, you know, I just don't like this. I don't like this bill. I'll tell you why. I've always thought about women as being kissable and cuddly and smelling good. Well, it was an absolute shock. And I didn't know how to kind of bring it down from this passionate level and bring it to sort of less. And of course, the only answer to that kind of thing is, I've always felt that way about men. I only hope you haven't been disappointed as often as I have. But I mean...
So you got up and said that.
See, yes, but you see, the thing is a little common sense, kind of, to bring us down to earth a little bit in all of this hierarchy. Because the truth is, you see, that if we had women in positions of power like men, there would be the same proportion of corruption and ego drive and all of it.
Women would not govern differently than men?
Certainly not.
It's 1974. You are serving as the head of the Consumer Affairs Division here in the state of New Jersey.
Right.
What motivated you to run for the United States Congress at 64 years of age?
It's the same old thing, like the running for the legislature. Somebody else suggests it. I was in Trenton and saw a friend of mine, a journalist, I think his name was John Davies, a reporter for the Camden paper. And he said to me, you know, Millicent, you better look at my column tomorrow. And so I thought, that's interesting. I wonder what he's going to say. And I got the paper and read it with great care. It said that Peter Frelinghuysen, who had been representing the 5th Congressional District for 22 years, was thinking of not running again. And everybody was talking about Millicent Fenwick running.
But you weren't thinking about it.
Never heard of such a thing. I didn't know Peter wasn't going to run. I didn't know any of these things. I never thought of running for Congress. I was perfectly happy in my district, representing Somerset County in Trenton. In fact, I have a picture of me taken in the legislature, and I think it's the happiest day in my life. I couldn't believe that I had been sent by my fellow citizens to represent them in the State House.
You weren't thinking about Washington.
Never imagined such a thing.
So you get talked about in this column.
Yeah.
Everyone else starts talking about Millicent Fenwick running for Congress, and you get swept up into it.
And I left the consumer director position April 4th in order to be qualify legally for the primary, in which Tom Kane and I had a very pleasant fight.
Let's talk about this Tom Kane fight with Millicent
Tom
Fenwick.
was so nice.
He was a young assemblyman.
He was Speaker.
He was Speaker of the House.
And young and awfully nice and a friend.
In a Republican primary.
Yeah. And the Friday before the election, we met, and I turned to him and I said, look here, Tom, this is the kind of primary that they ought to be held all the time.
Clean?
We didn't fight each other personally. We had some differences. I think I wanted Nixon to be impeached, and he didn't, but that was the only thing I can think of as a difference of issues, really, profoundly.
And you won by 83 votes.
Was it that?
Yes.
And we embraced in the parking lot under the lab, and I said, if you win, which you probably will next Tuesday, count on me. I'll be quiet if you don't want me to speak. I'll speak if you want speeches. I'll contribute time or a support, because this is really the way politics ought to be.
When you got elected to Congress, Richard Nixon was a big issue. Give me your feelings about Nixon at the time.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure I was right now that I look back, and maybe it would have shaken our country too deeply. But I thought he ought to be impeached. He should have been impeached, because Mr. Ford took over when he resigned, you know, when Nixon resigned. I was terribly disappointed that this would happen with a Republican president.
It was embarrassing to the party.
Oh, it was more than embarrassing. It was a terrible blow. And I felt awfully badly about it. And I thought that it would be an example to the country that no matter how powerful you are, you can be impeached.
Another name, another former president, Ronald Reagan.
He liked people, and he was eminently self-respecting. For instance, when they told him that when he was going to Ireland, there would be all these demonstrations, and didn't he feel badly about that against him? And he laughed. He said, not at all. He said, they're just trying to make me feel at home. I haven't been around this country in 2 years without a demonstration. You see, I think that someone with less self-respect and self-confidence would have said, well, people who aren't very intelligent always do these. You see what I mean?
What didn't you like about Ronald Reagan?
Well, what I didn't like about Ronald Reagan was the quality of some of the people that he seemed to feel were perfectly okay.
Around him? George Bush. How do you feel about George Bush?
I like him. The other day I was so touched, and he was so right. This problem with Neil Bush, his son. And you could see the agony in his face. He said, of course, as a father, I am naturally distressed. I'm sure all of you understand that. But I believe in the honor and integrity of my son as president. The system will work as it should, and he will fall into its effects as he may. Now, that is proper. You see what I mean? I thought, bravo, Bush.
Jim Florio. You served with Jim Florio in Congress.
Yeah.
Now he's governor. What's your sense of Florio?
Well, he may do some very fine things, and I certainly wouldn't criticize without study. But he's very, in my books, macho.
Macho?
I think that he enjoys authority, trenchant.
Interesting. Doonesbury. How did the Doonesbury character, Lacey Davenport,
I have no
come
idea.
about?
It was fascinating. Telephone rang one day, one of my friends in the press. How do you like being in the comics? I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, you're Lacey Davenport in Doonesbury. Well, I said, let me look into it. And there was one cartoon I terribly wanted to buy. It showed this ridiculous, hideous Lacey Davenport with her glasses and peering down at a little black man in a group of people on strike, carrying placards on strike. And Lacey Davenport was saying, you poor dears, that's perfectly terrible. And I thought, my God, where has this man heard me speak? So like, I was horrified.
You got it right.
Oh, of course. I was horrified and amused, and I would have loved to have bought that. But I thought, if I get in touch with him, will he think that I'm trying to encourage him or stop him?
So you never did?
No. How are you, dear?
The 1982 U.S. Senate campaign. Everyone said you were a winner. You were 20 points ahead. You were running against Frank Lautenberg. People didn't know him. What happened?
I don't know. I don't know, the next morning when I woke up, I thought it can't be. And Thursday morning I woke up and I said to myself, thank God I did. I'm not going to look back. I'm not going to worry about what happened or why. It has happened. And I'm not going to, everything is in the hands of the Lord. And I believe that, you see.
Let's talk about your assignment in Rome.
Well, I was defeated for the Senate, as you know, and I went back to clean up my desk, and I was sitting at my desk, and the telephone rang, White House wants to see you. Okay. So I go over to the White House, two charming young people I'd never met before. Would you be willing to work for this administration? I said, well, if I could be useful, I'd be delighted. Well, they finally proposed that I be ambassador from the United States to the food and agriculture missions. There were 4 of them in Rome. So I agreed to that. And also, I had some family in Rome. And I loved Italians, and I loved Rome, and I spoke Italian, and it seemed to me a most delightful end, because I could see it would be the last go-round, the last hurrah.
You spent about 50 years in public life. Very distinguished career. What would you say your greatest accomplishment was, or how would you want people to remember you?
Well, I'd like to be remembered as someone who tried to be useful.
One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been a production of the CAUCUS Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by RWJ Barnabas Health, Delta Dental of New Jersey, Rowan University, TD Bank, PSC&G, the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey, and by New Jersey Sharing Network. Promotional support provided by NJ.com and by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association.
I could feel my lungs fill with oxygen, and I got my life back.
The Sharing Network means to me hope, life, and everything.
The Sharing Network was a lifeline to me when I really needed it.
We are an organ procurement organization.
The core purpose of the New Jersey Sharing Network is to save and enhance lives.
To honor those who gave.
Pay tribute to those who received.
Offer hope to those who continue to wait.
And remember the lives lost while waiting.
For the gift of life.